Hello and welcome to the Demo Power Apps application. The demo application is published, so I'm going to go ahead and bring it up. Now, of course, my Office 365 domain is federated with EmpowerID, so the login process will take me through the EmpowerID login screen, but an EmpowerID login is not required to use this application. So let me go ahead and log in. Okay, so this is the demo application. Now, the core objective of the application is to demonstrate the integration of Power Apps and EmpowerID to surface on-premise and cloud-based data sources to a Power Apps application. The application is pretty simple and straightforward. It's a tablet Power Apps application. And in the application, as you can see, I can search for users and assign them Office 365 licenses and submit a request to a workflow or an API to perform the license assignment operation. So let me go ahead and demonstrate that. So I'm going to search for James. Okay. So it found a whole bunch of James. So here I can select multiple users. Let's select James Allen and another James. And then we have a bunch of licenses that I can also select and assign to these users. Now, once I've made my selection, I can submit the request to a workflow. And of course, I can also submit a request to an API instead of a workflow. So this is essentially the basic functionality of the application. Now, to show you how the pieces fit together, I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint. So for the design of the application that I just showed, what I showed you was the Power Apps application, which is essentially the user interface of the app. However, behind that is an intricate interaction of different components, and it includes Microsoft Flows and Azure App Service, and of course, the EmpowerID platform behind the scene. So from the demo app perspectives, the demo app connects to a number of flows that are published in Power Automate, and those flows interacts with API endpoints that are published in Azure App Service, and then those endpoints also integrates with EmpowerID. Now, for the security architecture, the demo app integrates with flows using just flow connections. The automate flows integrates with the app service using app service principal. And then the app service integrates with EmpowerID using Azure Managed Identities. So the security architecture is 100% Azure native. There isn't any custom security involved. It's all 100% Azure native. And the data flow is we're flowing data from the front end, the UI, all the way through to the back end. And we're also flowing data all the way from the back end to the UI. And that's what the application demonstrated just a minute ago. So next slide. The API behind the scene is actually developed in the EmpowerID Workflow Studio. Now in Workflow Studio, we have the ability to develop, build, and publish APIs directly to Azure App Services. So what you see here on the screen is an example of how that can be implemented. in Workflow Studio, we can create the API endpoints and publish them directly to the Azure App Service. And of course, the APIs that you develop in Workflow Studio do have the ability to integrate with EmpowerID data sources using native Azure security, such as the service principal or managed identities. So behind the scene of the APIs is the Microsoft Flows. So it's within the flow that we actually call the REST endpoint. So the flow application will actually perform the native Azure authentication and call the API in the Azure App Service. So that is what we're seeing here. So flow connects to the Azure App Service based APIs, and that's how we're able to surface data to the Power Apps application. So this is an example of one of the API calls here. This is the API endpoint get licenses. So this flow will actually make a call to the app service to get the licenses and surface the data to the Power Apps application. And we'll go to the next slide, and you can see here we've put together a number of flows, and each flow is actually a REST API call to the endpoints on the app service. And here we can see that in Power Apps, we can see the Power Apps flows that we have developed in the Power Automate. So these are the flows, and they are surfaced here in Power Apps. And within Power Apps, we can connect to these flows as essentially our data sources, and then we can develop the UI elements and tie them to the data sources that are coming from the flow. So this is how the integration, everything comes together, where we have Power Apps integrated with the flows, and the flows are essentially acting as our data sources for the Power Apps application. So overall, here's how it comes together. So when I went into the application and searched for James, what has happened is that the search button simply made a call to the REST API hosted in the Azure App Service. Of course, the call is made through the flows, right? So the flow is called, which then calls the API, and the API calls whatever data source that it needs to call or access to bring data back again through the same channel, back to the flow, and then back to the Power Apps application. Okay, so switching back to the application, I can search for any user here. I will use Patrick as an example. And once I click on the search button, there's a call being made through Flow to the APIs to essentially query EmpowerID for a list of users and, of course, a list of licenses. Now, again, when we submit a request to a workflow to run a workflow, or we submit a request to an API, we're going through the same process. Okay, so now let me go to my developer environment to show the technical side of all of this, how all of this essentially comes together. So let me log into my development environment here. Okay, so here is Workflow Studio. And in Workflow Studio, you can, of course, create the API endpoints that you can publish to the Azure App Service. So here we created an API called the Azure Native License API. And this is just an example, but it can be any kind of API that we can develop here in Workflow Studio. So the code is very simple. It has a number of endpoints. If you want to take a look at the controller, here is the controller that exposes all the different endpoints that we can call. So for example, the search button calls get app users, and the license controls that you see in the interface where we display the list of licenses, that calls this endpoint. And then when we submit data to run a workflow or to API, we call this create apps licenses. So this is the API that we publish to the app service. Here in Workflow Studio, you can identify the app service in Azure that you want to publish the endpoints to, and Workflow Studio will do the publishing automatically for you. So there isn't a whole bunch of difficulty in terms of publishing APIs to the Azure App Service. So now once we've published the API endpoints to the Azure App Service, the next step is to develop the flows or to connect flows to that to endpoints on the app service. So here I've created 3 flows. Each flow represents an endpoint. So for example, let's go to the get users flow. Let's take a look at that. Let's do an edit so we can dive into that. Okay, so that comes up. The first step or the first action that you see in the flow is Power Apps. This indicates that the flow is a Power Apps flow. That is, the flow is compatible with Power Apps. So when we go into Power Apps, this flow will show up and we can connect to it as a data source that we can then we can interact with the flow, since it shows up in Power Apps as a data source that we can integrate with. So in this flow, we indicate that it is a Power Apps flow. And the next step is to essentially authenticate to get an Azure Access Token to be able to call the API endpoints that we have in the app service. Now, if we switch back quickly to look at the app service, so this is the app service that we're publishing the endpoints to. Here in Workflow Studio, you can see that we're publishing the endpoints to this API service. So this is that API service. If we go to the authentication and authorization, you can see that app service authentication is enabled, and the authentication is to log in with Azure Active Directory. So this app service is not anonymous. So there's no way we can interact with API endpoints in this app service without authenticating and providing an appropriate security context. So that is what we're doing here in this step. So in this step, we connect to Azure AD, authenticate using simple client credentials. So this is essentially authentication with a service principal. And once we authenticate and we get an access token back from Azure Active Directory, we then process the token. And with that, we can access the access token from the token. And then use that access token to essentially call the endpoint. And here you can see that this is the app service where the get apps users endpoint is located. So this is the URL of the REST API endpoint that we'll be calling. And this is how we've set up the authorization with the access token. And here are some parameters that we're passing to the REST API call. So here you can see that we've generated some variables, and these variables that we pass into the REST endpoints will be populated by our Power Apps application. So once we have this flow set up, we can simply switch back to our Power Apps application. And in Power Apps, where we have our application, if we go to Power Automate, we're going to see the Power Apps compatible flows that we have. They show up here. And now, since they are up here, we can simply bring them into our Power Apps application as a data source. So for example, if we go to the search button here, you can see up here that there's a little script here that simply calls our flow. So here we call this flow to run it, pass it some information, and of course the flow is right here. It's simply going to authenticate with Azure AD, get an access token, make API call to our endpoints on the Azure App Service, passing the access token that we obtained from Azure AD. And of course, here we're processing the response that we get back, and then we're providing the response back to our Power Apps application. So we can display the results, for example, that we get back in something like a table or in a drop-down list or whatever UI elements that we have here in the app. So this is essentially how easy and straightforward it is to integrate Power Apps with EmpowerID, and we can essentially surface any data, whether it's on premise or in the cloud, as long as we have that data inventoried into EmpowerID, we can very quickly and rather easily surface that information to a Power Apps application. And that is the end of the session. So if there are any questions, I'll be very happy to answer them over emails or any other follow-up meeting. Thank you.